What happens when the love you once shared fades quietly, piece by piece, until you're left wondering if it was ever truly there? When ambition and pride silently tear two people apart, can anything ever be rebuilt? Isabella sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. Her fingers hovered over a picture frame on the mantel, tracing the edges of the photo as her eyes lingered on the image of a younger version of herself and Julian. It was a time she could barely recognize now, when love was effortless and their future seemed endless. They had been two halves of a whole. But time had a way of eroding even the strongest of bonds. What once felt like the foundation of everything had slipped into distant memories. Now, Isabella lived in a world where Julian's name was only spoken with a mix of longing and regret, a name she couldn't say without feeling the weight of years apart. He had become the man he always dreamed of being, a billionaire, a force in the business world. His empire was vast, his influence undeniable. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the things that truly mattered, her and their son, Liam. Isabella had tried not to resent him. She understood his drive, the hunger for success, but she couldn't ignore the loneliness that settled in her heart. And the question lingered, how had they let ambition pull them so far apart? How had it all been lost, not through one big betrayal, but through countless small, silent decisions? Julian's ambition had consumed him, while Isabella had devoted herself to Liam, trying to raise him in a world that felt increasingly disconnected from the man she once loved. Their love hadn't ended with a fight or a betrayal. It had ended with distance, an emotional divide so wide that neither of them knew how to cross it anymore. Isabella sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The house, once filled with the sound of laughter and warmth, felt quiet now, still in a way that matched the ache she felt in her chest. Her fingers lingered over a picture frame on the mantel, tracing the smooth glass as if she could somehow touch the past that had slipped away from her. The photo was from a time when everything had seemed right, when Julian and she were inseparable, two halves of a whole. She had been young, full of dreams and hope, just like him. The photo had captured their smiles, a memory of that summer they spent in the mountains. Back then, it felt like the future stretched out ahead of them, endless and full of promise. Julian's hand had been around her waist, pulling her close, as if he would never let go. And in that moment, she had believed it. She believed in their love and the life they were going to build together. But now, the weight of those memories seemed almost too heavy to carry. The once warm and bustling house now felt too large, too empty. She could barely recognize the woman she had become. Isabella had spent years making sure their son, Liam, grew up in a stable, loving environment. She worked to be present for every school event, every recital, every milestone. But over time, the toll it had taken on her was evident. She found herself silently, longing for something more, for Julian to notice her again, for him to remember that there was more to life than work. The man she had once fallen in love with, the man who had once held her with such certainty, had slowly faded into someone unrecognizable. She still loved him. There was no question about that. But love alone didn't hold everything together. She couldn't pretend anymore that the sacrifices she had made in the name of family didn't sting. The emotional distance between them had grown so quietly, so slowly, that Isabella hadn't even realized it at first. She had given him space, given him time to build his empire. After all, that's what he had always wanted, right? He had always talked about the future, the company he would grow, the legacy he would leave behind. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped talking about their future together, the future he had promised her. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of silence felt too heavy to bear, Isabella had started to wonder, had he forgotten that promise? Had he forgotten her? She looked down at the photo again, taking in their faces frozen in time. She could still hear his voice, his laugh. She could remember how he would hold her close, whispering about all the things they would do when the world was theirs. But now, all she had were these photos, memories that seemed more like fragments of another lifetime. They no longer represented the couple they were. They were just remnants of a love that had slipped away like sand between her fingers. There had been no grand falling out, no explosive fight, no affair. It had been quieter than that. Much quieter. The love they had shared hadn't ended with a bang. It had ended with silence, with him coming home late every night, with broken promises, with the slow erosion of their connection. She never confronted him, never demanded answers. She didn't want to be the one to make it hurt even more. So, instead, she withdrew. She focused on their son, focused on what needed to be done. She gave him everything she had, and in return, Julian became a shadow, a distant figure who came home only to sleep, never to really be present. She had tried not to resent him. She knew he was driven. She knew how much he cared about his work, about building something that would last. But as the years passed, the distance between them grew, and slowly, that resentment started to build. It was a quiet resentment, one that festered quietly in the corners of her heart. How had they ended up here? How had they allowed ambition and pride to pull them apart? Liam was growing up without the bond he should have had with his father. Isabella could see the toll it was taking on him. He was angry, more angry than any teenager should be. He acted out in ways that worried her, and it hurt her to see him struggle, to know that the gap between father and son was widening every day. She had never wanted this for Liam. She wanted him to grow up with two parents who were present, who were invested in his life. But now, it felt like she was the only one left to carry the load. And the weight of that responsibility, of being both mother and father, was heavy on her shoulders. The phone call came late one evening when she least expected it. She had just put Liam to bed after another one of his outbursts. She was sitting on the couch, exhausted, when the ringtone pulled her from her thoughts. It was Julian. She answered the phone with a sigh, preparing herself for the usual conversation, a quick check-in, a promise to talk later. But this time, his voice was different. There was a crack in it, a rawness she hadn't heard in years. "I need you to help me." Julian's voice crackled through the phone, tight with strain. "Liam's been causing trouble at school, and the board is breathing down my neck. I don't know who else to turn to." Isabella froze. She hadn't heard Julian this vulnerable in so long. It shocked her, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She had always known him to be the one in control, the one who had it all figured out. But now, here he was, sounding desperate, sounding like he needed her, not just as the mother of their son, but as a partner again. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before he spoke again, his voice softer. "I can't do this alone, Isabella. I don't know who else to turn to." Her mind raced. She had spent years keeping a distance, focusing on Liam, trying to heal the hurt. She had never expected Julian to ask for her help, but now, as she heard the strain in his voice, something inside her shifted. This wasn't about the past, about old wounds. This was about their son. It was about the family they had built, even if it was broken. She exhaled slowly and ran a hand through her hair. "I'll help. We'll figure it out," she said, the words coming out more firmly than she had expected. It wasn't for him, not at first. It wasn't even about Julian at all. It was about Liam. It was about the responsibility that she still shared with him, despite everything that had happened. And in that moment, she realized that she couldn't walk away from this, not now, not when there was still a chance to fix what was broken. Sometimes, responsibility compels us to take the first step toward reconciliation, even if it's hard. Even when it feels like the past is too heavy to bear, the present still calls us to act. Have you ever found yourself having to step in and help someone you've grown distant from? How did it feel to reconnect, even in a time of crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and late nights. Isabella threw herself into the task of helping Julian with the business crisis, her thoughts fixed on the present, not the past. It wasn't the first time she'd taken the reins in their family's struggles, but this time felt different. Julian was desperate, leaning on her in ways he hadn't done in years. The cracks in their relationship had opened wider, and now she could see, more clearly than ever, how far they had drifted. Despite the tension that filled the air, there were moments of connection. The quiet exchange of ideas in board meetings, the subtle ways Julian began to rely on her insight. She had always been sharp, intelligent, and resourceful, but now he was acknowledging it in ways that had once felt effortless. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, to feel needed again, after all this time, after so many years of emotional distance. But still, the weight of their unresolved issues lingered. It was hard to ignore the fact that they had both failed each other in countless ways. Julian had neglected her for so long, lost in his pursuit of wealth and status, leaving her to handle everything alone. Isabella had, in turn, built walls around herself to protect her heart, to prevent it from breaking any further. And now, as they worked side by side, those walls were slowly being tested. Julian wasn't the man he had once been. He wasn't the same confident, driven individual who had swept her off her feet years ago. The man who had been so certain of his place in the world now seemed unsure, vulnerable in a way that made her uneasy. He no longer had the same arrogant air, but instead there was something softer, something broken in his eyes. He had made mistakes, big mistakes, and now there was no way to undo the damage. The question, though, was whether they could rebuild something from the wreckage. One evening, after a long day of strategizing and calls with investors, they found themselves alone in the office. The air was thick with unspoken words. Julian, for the first time in a while, seemed at a loss for how to proceed. He sat across from Isabella, his shoulders slumped, his hand resting on the edge of the desk, fingers tapping nervously. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Isabella," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I've spent so much time trying to build something that I thought would make me happy, but I've neglected everything else along the way. You, Liam. I've been blind." Isabella's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. It wasn't the kind of confession she had expected from Julian. He had never been one to admit weakness, to show that kind of raw honesty. It was strange, hearing him say these things, knowing that so many years had passed without them addressing the real issues between them. For a moment, Isabella simply watched him. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Could she trust him again? Could she really let go of the years of emotional neglect, the silent heartbreak she had endured? Could she forget all the times he promised to be there for her, only to be consumed by his work? "I've been so focused on keeping everything together," she finally replied, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't even stop to think about what I needed. I just kept going because I had to. Liam needed me. You weren't there. You were too busy building this empire." The word empire felt heavy on her tongue, as if it represented everything that had pulled them apart. She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to continue. She had made a choice years ago to put their family first, to build a life that would be stable for Liam. But the cost had been her own happiness, her own needs. And now, as she sat here, with Julian across from her, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Julian's expression softened as he watched her. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but they were elusive, just beyond his reach. His gaze flickered with regret, but also a quiet hope, as though he was still trying to figure out how to make things right. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see how I've failed you, failed us." The silence between them hung in the air like a thick fog. Isabella closed her eyes, her emotions a tangle of frustration, sadness, and something deeper, a yearning that she had long buried. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he had changed, that he wasn't the same man who had let her down time and time again. But her heart was cautious, guarded by years of hurt. The room was quiet, save for the sound of their breathing. Then, without thinking, Julian reached across the desk, his hand hovering near hers. His fingers trembled slightly before he made the tentative move to brush his hand against hers. It was a small gesture, but one that held more meaning than anything they had shared in a long time. Isabella felt a shiver run down her spine at the touch, an old connection, faint but undeniable. Isabella looked up at him, their eyes meeting for the first time in what felt like forever. There were no words between them now, no promises, no grand gestures, just a silent understanding that maybe this could be the beginning of something new. But it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be long, filled with the weight of their past mistakes. They would have to rebuild, brick by brick, trust by trust. For the first time in a long while, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back. "I don't know if we can fix this," she said softly, her voice a quiet reflection of the hope she was afraid to embrace. "But maybe it's worth trying." And in that moment, as they both sat in the quiet of the office, the first crack in the wall that had divided them for so long began to form. Trust can be rebuilt through shared responsibility, even when the past weighs heavily. Emotional safety grows out of small, consistent acts. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you cared about had to show vulnerability to rebuild trust? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The following week, as the tension between Julian and Isabella continued to simmer just below the surface, an unexpected call arrived. It wasn't the usual business chatter that Julian often sent her way. This time, it was different. His voice on the other end of the line was raw, strained, and, strangely, vulnerable. "I need you to help me." Julian's voice crackled with a sense of urgency that Isabella hadn't heard in years. "Liam's been acting out at school. His behavior's worse than it's ever been. And the board, God, the board is breathing down my neck about the business crisis. I don't know who else to turn to." Isabella sat still for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. There had been no real conversation between them for months, no direct acknowledgement of the emotional chasm that had formed between them. And now, here he was, reaching out for help, not for the business, but for their son. He was asking for her help, for her insight. And she couldn't help but feel the old stirrings of affection, the same feelings that had once made her fall in love with him. It was an odd moment, a mix of unexpected vulnerability and a strange sense of duty to the family they had once been. Isabella's gaze shifted to the living room, where Liam's schoolwork lay scattered across the table. She hadn't heard from him yet today, but the frustration in Julian's voice was enough to break through her mental barrier. She couldn't ignore it. Not now. "Julian," she started, unsure of where the words would lead. "You've been distant from him, from both of us." She hesitated, not wanting to put all the blame on him, but the words tumbled out anyway. "I've been raising Liam alone, you know that. He needs you. We both do. But I'll help. We'll figure it out." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Julian didn't speak for a few seconds, and Isabella wondered if he was processing what she had said. Finally, his voice returned, softer this time. "Thank you. I know I've been absent. I didn't realize how much he was struggling, how much I was letting him down. I've failed you both." The admission hit her harder than she expected. She had always known Julian to be confident, almost arrogantly so. For him to admit that he had failed, especially when it came to Liam, was a sharp shift in their dynamic. It felt surreal, hearing him acknowledge the distance he had created between them, and yet there was something that moved in her chest. Perhaps it was the realization that, for the first time in a long while, he was asking for help, asking for her. Isabella's mind raced as she thought about the fragile state their family was in. She had been holding everything together for years, emotionally bracing herself against the growing divide between her and Julian. She had focused on Liam, on providing him with a stable home, but she had never stopped to ask for help herself. Not until now. "I'll meet you at the house tomorrow," she said finally, her voice steady. "We'll talk to Liam, together. It's not too late to fix this, but you need to show up. For him. For both of us." "I will," Julian replied, his voice laced with sincerity. "I promise." The line went silent for a moment, and then Julian added quietly, "Thank you, Isabella." Isabella hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, the quiet of the room pressing in around her. She had agreed to help. But the truth was, she wasn't sure if she was ready to let Julian back into her life. Not fully. Not yet. Their relationship had always been about more than just Liam's needs, and she wasn't sure if Julian had truly seen that. She wasn't sure if he even knew how much distance had grown between them. But the call had been a start, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. She took a deep breath, standing up and walking toward the window. Outside, the streets were quiet, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. As she looked out over the city, she wondered what the next steps would be, what it would take to rebuild what they had lost, and if it was even possible. For now, though, the only thing she could do was move forward, one step at a time. The next day, Isabella found herself driving to the house where she had once lived with Julian, the place that had once felt like a sanctuary but now seemed more like a memory. The car ride was silent, the air between her and Liam thick with the unspoken tension that had been hanging over them for months. He didn't say a word as she drove, his face turned toward the window, lost in his thoughts. When they arrived, Julian was already there, standing by the front door, looking every bit the powerful, successful businessman he had become. His posture was rigid, and he looked like a man caught between two worlds, the world of business, where he was in control, and the world of family, where he was clearly unsure of his place. Isabella stepped out of the car, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what to expect. Julian had always been quick to take control, quick to fix things. But this time, it felt different. There was no grand gesture, no bold statement. It was just the quiet, heavy task of trying to rebuild something that had been broken for too long. "Isabella," Julian greeted her, his voice tentative, almost unsure. He gave her a small nod, then turned to Liam, who was already making his way inside, avoiding his father's gaze. "Liam, we need to talk," Julian said, his tone firm but not harsh. "I know you've been struggling, and I need to be here for you as your father. I've made mistakes, and I'm sorry for that." Liam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at his father as though trying to gauge whether he was truly sincere or just putting on an act. His eyes narrowed slightly, his arms crossed defensively. Isabella stood off to the side, watching the exchange with a sense of quiet understanding. She could see the walls between Julian and Liam, the unspoken distance that had grown between them. And though she wasn't sure how long it would take to tear those walls down, she knew one thing: the effort needed to come from both sides. "We're in this together," she said quietly, stepping forward to stand next to Julian. "We'll get through this, but it'll take time, patience, and understanding." Julian looked at her, his gaze softening for a brief moment before he turned back to Liam. "I'll be patient," Julian said. "I'll earn back your trust, Liam. I promise." Liam hesitated, his gaze shifting between his parents. It was a long moment before he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can trust you again." And just like that, the truth of their years of neglect was laid bare. But for the first time in a long while, Isabella felt something shift within her. There was no guarantee that things would be easy, or that the distance between Julian and Liam would disappear overnight. But she knew one thing: they were finally taking the first step forward. The first step in rebuilding everything that had been broken. The next few days passed in a blur of family meetings, therapy sessions for Liam, and late-night conversations between Julian and Isabella. For the first time in what felt like years, they were speaking openly about their son, about their fractured relationship, about the things that had gone wrong. But even as they worked together to make things right for Liam, Isabella couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had settled in her heart. Could this really be the beginning of something new? Or was it just another temporary fix, another attempt to patch up what was already broken? The emotional tension between Julian and Isabella was palpable. They spent most of their time focusing on Liam's issues, but whenever their eyes met, there was an unspoken question hanging between them. Could they heal what had been damaged? Could they find a way back to each other? Or had too much time passed for anything to truly change? Julian seemed different, less sure of himself, more open. His usual arrogance, the confident billionaire who had once been untouchable, was replaced with a quiet humility that Isabella found both strange and, in some ways, comforting. He was showing up, truly showing up, for Liam, but she wasn't sure if that meant he was ready to show up for her. One evening, after they had spent hours working on Liam's behavior and discussing school plans, Isabella found herself sitting alone in the kitchen, sipping on a cup of tea. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. It had been a long day, and yet Isabella couldn't seem to turn her mind off. Julian entered quietly, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He paused when he saw her, his eyes studying her, as though trying to figure out if she was still there, or if she was already somewhere else, emotionally distant once again. "Isabella," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" She looked up at him, her hand still holding the cup, but her mind was far away. She didn't respond immediately, just watched him as he slowly approached the table, taking a seat across from her. His gaze never left hers, but there was something different about him, vulnerable, as if he was unsure of what came next. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," Julian began, his voice thick with sincerity. "I've made so many mistakes, and I've hurt you in ways I didn't even realize until now." Isabella felt a tightening in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. She had heard apologies before, of course, words that were supposed to fix things, to make everything better. But this time, there was something different about it. There was no deflection, no excuses, just a man who seemed truly aware of the damage he had caused. She set the cup down on the table, her fingers tracing the rim absently. "It's not just about the mistakes, Julian. It's about how much time we've wasted, how much we've both neglected." She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but his response was quieter than she anticipated. "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't see it then. I didn't understand what I was losing. But I see it now, Isabella. I see how far I pushed you away, how much I took for granted. You gave up so much for me, for this family. And I let my ambition blind me to what mattered most." His words hung in the air, filling the space between them. There was a long silence before Isabella spoke again. "Julian, we can't just undo the years. You've been gone, emotionally, for so long. I don't know how to fix that. I don't know how to trust again." She felt the weight of those words. They weren't meant to push him away, but to tell him the truth. Trust wasn't something that could be given back in one conversation, in one moment of vulnerability. It would take time. So much time. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can change, that I can be the man I should have been for you. No, for us. Years ago." Isabella looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in so long. She saw the man who had once captivated her, the man who had promised her everything. But this time, she saw him differently, without the rose-colored lens of love, but with the reality of years of hurt and disappointment between them. She had built a life without him, a life that didn't revolve around his success or his failures. She had learned to be self-sufficient, to stand on her own 2 feet. But now, as she sat across from him, she realized something. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But she wasn't ready to walk away either. The silence between them grew, stretching out for what felt like an eternity. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that held her back. Maybe it was the fear that if she let him back in, she would risk losing herself again. Maybe it was the fear that, even after everything, Julian would never be the man she had hoped he would be. But there was a quiet part of her that still wanted to believe in the man he could become, in the family they could rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be fast, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "But I'm willing to try. For Liam. For us." The words felt like a promise, but also a warning. She wasn't asking for perfection. She wasn't expecting him to fix everything overnight. But this was a start, a small step forward. Julian nodded slowly, a look of quiet gratitude crossing his face. "That's all I can ask for. A chance to show you that I can change." Isabella sat back in her chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't sure where this would lead, or how much time it would take to rebuild what had been lost. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. And maybe that was enough, for now. The days following their conversation were filled with the delicate, awkward dance of 2 people trying to find their way back to something they once had. Julian made an effort, small gestures that Isabella hadn't expected. He called more frequently, not about business, but just to check in on her, on Liam. He was present in a way that felt unfamiliar, yet genuine. He was finally showing up, but the past was still a heavy weight between them, and it would take more than a few phone calls to lift it. Isabella found herself caught between hope and skepticism. She wanted to believe that Julian could change. She wanted to believe that they could rebuild, not just the fractured connection between them, but the family they had once dreamed of. But part of her remained guarded, unwilling to let herself fall back into the cycle of disappointment that had become so familiar over the years. It wasn't just Julian's actions that she was unsure of, it was herself. She had built a life without him, a life where her emotional well-being didn't depend on his presence, where she had found strength in her independence. But now, as she saw him trying, truly trying, to be there for Liam, to take responsibility for the cracks in their relationship, she was torn. Could she allow herself to lean on him again? Could she allow herself to trust that the man before her was someone she could truly rely on? One evening, Julian arrived at the house after a long day at work. The moment he stepped through the door, Isabella could sense the change in him. He didn't look like the confident businessman who had once been consumed by his empire. He looked tired, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. His shoulders were slumped, his tie loosened, his hair slightly tousled. He looked like a man who was finally facing the weight of his own choices. "I thought we could have dinner," Julian said, his voice tentative, as if he wasn't sure what she might say. "I wanted to spend some time with you, with Liam." Isabella, who had been in the kitchen preparing a simple meal, stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. It wasn't the grand gesture she had once hoped for, the romantic dinner or the sweeping apologies, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet sincerity that caught her off guard. For a brief moment, she hesitated. The walls she had carefully constructed over the years felt fragile, as if a single push could shatter them. But something inside her softened, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about moving forward, step by step, slowly, carefully, and with trust that would have to be earned in time. "I think that sounds nice," she said, the words feeling like the first real step they had taken in a long while. She smiled faintly, but the weight of the moment lingered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. As they sat down to dinner, the conversation was light at first. Small talk about Liam's schoolwork, about the things they had been doing around the house. But slowly, as they ate, the conversation deepened. Julian began to talk more openly about his day, about the pressures he was facing at work, about the weight of the decisions that had led him here. It was strange, hearing him speak this way. He was no longer the man who dominated every conversation with his opinions and ambitions. Instead, he was vulnerable, sharing the doubts and fears he had kept buried for so long. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Julian said, his voice quiet. "About how much I've focused on success, on building this empire, and I've lost sight of what really matters. I've lost you. I've lost Liam. I've lost everything that's worth holding on to." Isabella watched him closely, listening to the weight of his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly seeing him. Not the man he had become, but the man he used to be. The man who had once been her partner. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the genuine regret. But the years of emotional distance still lingered, like a shadow that couldn't be easily dismissed. "I can't just forget everything, Julian," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I can't just pretend that we can pick up where we left off. You can't undo the past with words. I'm not asking you to, but you have to understand that it's going to take time. I can't trust you overnight." Julian nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking for a chance to prove myself, one small step at a time." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken thoughts filling the room. It wasn't a resolution, not yet. But it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. It wasn't about rushing back to the love they had once shared. It was about slowly, carefully, rebuilding what had been broken. And in that quiet moment, Isabella realized that perhaps this was the first real step toward healing for both of them. The days following their quiet dinner were a fragile balance. Julian was still showing up, his presence in their home more consistent than it had been in years. He spent time with Liam, helping with his schoolwork and trying to engage him in a way that didn't feel forced. It wasn't easy. The damage that had been done couldn't be undone in a few days or even a few weeks. But at least he was trying. Isabella, for her part, had allowed herself to soften just a little. She had stopped holding her emotions so tightly to her chest. There were moments when she could see the sincerity in Julian's eyes, and a small part of her dared to hope. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by the resentment she couldn't seem to shake. Every time she looked at him, her mind flashed to the years of emotional neglect, the lonely nights, the promises broken, the moments when she had needed him and he had been absent. Julian had been a ghost in their home for so long, always physically there but never truly present. And now, as he worked to rebuild what had been broken, Isabella couldn't help but feel like he was only doing it because he had no other choice. He had lost the luxury of time, of understanding. He had ignored her for too long. Isabella's heart ached as she watched Julian trying to connect with Liam. She knew he wanted to make things right, but the years of neglect had left Liam emotionally distant too. And no matter how hard Julian tried, it didn't seem to be enough. There were moments of breakthrough, but they were followed by setbacks. Long silences between father and son, Liam retreating into his own world, unsure of whether he could trust his father again. In the quiet of their home, Isabella found herself torn between the man she had once loved and the man who now sat across from her, trying to make amends. She wanted to believe in the man he was becoming. She wanted to trust that he had learned from his mistakes. But the scars of the past were too fresh, too raw. She couldn't just pretend that everything was okay, not when the damage had been done over years. One evening, after Liam had gone to bed, Julian and Isabella found themselves alone in the living room, sitting in silence. Julian had been quieter than usual, his eyes distant, as if he were trying to figure out what to say. He had been making an effort, yes, but it was clear that he was still struggling with the weight of everything that had transpired. Isabella had been avoiding the conversation, not because she didn't want to have it, but because she wasn't sure if she was ready. The past few days had felt like a fragile truce, a tentative peace between them, but peace wasn't the same as healing, and they both knew it. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "Isabella," he began, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I know I've made mistakes, I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo the past. But I need you to know that I'm trying to be a better man. For you, for Liam, for us." His words, though sincere, didn't quite land the way he had hoped. Isabella felt a pang of frustration deep in her chest. He couldn't just say the words and expect everything to be fixed. They had talked about this before, over and over again, about how much time he had wasted, how much he had taken her for granted. And now, as he sat there, asking for her understanding, she wasn't sure if she could give it to him. "Julian," she said softly but firmly, her voice laced with years of unsaid emotions. "You keep saying that you're trying, but trying isn't enough. You've been absent for so long. You've built this empire, and that's great, but you've neglected the most important thing. You've neglected me. You've neglected Liam. We've been living separate lives in the same house for far too long, and now you want to come in and fix it. But it doesn't work that way." Julian's face fell, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't expected this kind of response. He had hoped that his sincerity, his attempts to show up, would be enough. But Isabella was right. Trying wasn't enough. Not when so much time had passed. "I know," he said, his voice breaking with regret. "I know it's not enough. And I can't expect you to forgive me just because I say the words. But I need you to understand that I see it now. I see how much I've failed you. And I'm sorry." Isabella looked at him for a long time, her heart torn between the man he was and the man he used to be. She had once loved him with everything she had, and even now, a part of her still loved him. But that love had been buried under years of neglect, years of unmet needs. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever get past what's been done. But I'm trying too. I'm trying to believe that we can fix this. I'm trying to believe in you again. But it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight." The silence between them grew, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Julian reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the armrest between them. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew that this conversation, this raw, honest moment, was a step forward. "I'll wait," Julian said, his voice steady, but filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't expected. "I'll wait as long as it takes. I know I've lost your trust, and I don't expect it to come back quickly. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. For you. For Liam." Isabella looked at him, her heart softening despite herself. There was something in his eyes, something that told her he was committed, not just to fixing their relationship, but to doing the work it would take to rebuild it from the ground up. She didn't know if she was ready to let him back in completely, but she could see that he was willing to try. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. "I'll try too," she said softly, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. "But it's going to take time. You can't rush this. You can't just expect everything to go back to the way it was." "I don't expect that," Julian replied, his voice full of sincerity. "I just want a chance to prove that I can be the man you need me to be, the man I should have been all along." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past still heavy between them. But in that silence, there was something new, something tentative, yet hopeful, the first step toward healing. The days that followed their conversation were filled with subtle, almost imperceptible changes. Julian and Isabella went through the motions of daily life, navigating the tension between them with cautious care. The air was still thick with the weight of their history, years of hurt, missed opportunities, and unspoken words. But there was something different now. It was fragile, barely noticeable at times, but there was a sense of commitment from Julian and from Isabella too. They had agreed to try, and that was enough for now. Julian had been showing up. He had stopped by Liam's school to check on his progress, attended every therapy session with him, and even asked about Isabella's day. Truly asked, with interest, rather than the usual polite, distracted exchange. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds, but it was a start. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt like he was here, really here. But even as Julian worked hard to prove his commitment, there was still a nagging sense of doubt in the back of Isabella's mind. She couldn't let go of the years of silence, of emotional neglect. She had poured so much of herself into their family, only to be met with Julian's absence. It was hard, almost impossible, to just forget about all of that and pick up where they had left off. The love they had once shared couldn't just be resurrected with a few kind gestures. The foundation had cracked, and it wasn't something she could fix overnight, but maybe she didn't have to fix it all. Not yet. Maybe all she could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, after another long day of family therapy and business negotiations, Isabella found herself standing at the kitchen counter, quietly chopping vegetables for dinner. She had learned over the years to find peace in these small moments, the repetitive tasks that gave her time to think, to breathe. She needed these moments of quiet to process everything that had been happening. Julian had left for a meeting, his usual business affairs keeping him away, and Liam was in his room, working on a school project. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Isabella's thoughts wandered, as they often did, back to the past. She thought about when they had first met, how easy it had been to be with Julian then. He had been so present, so passionate about their future. But somewhere along the way, that passion had been replaced by something else, something that had consumed him. And now, as she stood in the kitchen, she realized that she wasn't just angry at him. She was angry at herself too. Angry that she had allowed this to go on for so long, that she had allowed herself to be neglected. She had let him take the lead for so many years, not realizing how much of herself she had lost along the way. She had become a mother, a caretaker, a woman focused solely on everyone else's needs. But where had she gone in the process? Her thoughts were interrupted when Julian returned, his presence filling the doorway. He looked different, more relaxed, more human. Not the distant CEO she had become so used to, but a man who was trying to reconnect, trying to show up. "Isabella?" he asked gently, his voice carrying an undertone of concern. "I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, her heart heavy with everything unsaid. "I'm fine, just thinking," she replied, her voice soft. Julian walked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter next to her. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. Instead, he simply stood there, as if waiting for her to speak. Isabella paused, the knife resting in her hand as she looked at him. She studied his face, the lines of stress, the exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. "I'm sorry," Julian said quietly, his voice filled with remorse. "I know it's been hard on you, on Liam. I haven't been there, and I've been so focused on everything else that I forgot what's really important." Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat, her hand trembling slightly as she set the knife down. For the first time, it felt like Julian wasn't just speaking to fill the silence. He wasn't offering more empty promises. He was speaking from a place of raw honesty, acknowledging what he had done and the hurt it had caused. She wiped her hands on a towel, then turned to face him fully. "You've been absent, Julian, for so long. I've been doing this alone. And it's not just about the business, it's about being here. For me, for Liam, for us." Julian's eyes softened with understanding. He nodded slowly, his voice quieter now. "I know, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here, for you, for Liam." Her heart clenched at his words, but a small part of her remained cautious. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust him yet. Not after everything, not after so many years of silence. But there was a part of her that still wanted to believe him, still wanted to believe in the man he was becoming. "I'm trying, Julian," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "But trust takes time. I don't know if I can just forgive you overnight. I don't know if I can let go of everything that's happened." He nodded again, his eyes full of sorrow. "I know. I'm not asking you to. I just want a chance. A chance to prove that I can be better, that I can be the man you need me to be." Isabella looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a long time. She saw the man who had been so focused on his own ambitions that he had forgotten what truly mattered. But she also saw something else now, a man who was finally willing to confront the damage he had caused, to acknowledge his failures, and to make the effort to rebuild what had been lost. "I can't promise you that things will go back to the way they were," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm willing to try, for Liam, for us. But it's not going to be easy." Julian's face lit up with a small, relieved smile. "That's all I can ask for. A chance." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation sinking in. The air between them was thick with everything that had been left unsaid. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the same page. Slowly, cautiously, they were beginning to rebuild what had been broken. The days after their quiet dinner felt like a turning point, though it was hard to tell if it was the beginning of something real or just another fleeting attempt at reconnection. Julian and Isabella continued to move forward, but the weight of their past still hung over them, creating a delicate tension in the air. They went through the motions, attending therapy sessions for Liam, discussing his progress, and trying to make the most of the time they had together as a family. Yet despite their efforts, it felt like they were still walking on fragile ground, each step careful, tentative. Isabella found herself grappling with an unfamiliar sense of hope, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was almost like a part of her had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable, to believe in something again. But Julian's small gestures, the way he showed up for Liam, the way he was trying to prove that he was willing to be present, began to stir something in her. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart started to soften, though she was still unsure if she was ready to fully let him back in. Julian, on the other hand, was doing everything he could to prove that he was committed, not just to the business, not just to his own success, but to them. He had taken time off work to focus on the family. He had cancelled a few important meetings, telling his partners that family came first, that he needed to be present. It was something he had never done before. Isabella watched him closely, observing his every move, his every word. She was looking for consistency, for proof that this wasn't just a fleeting effort. He had made mistakes. She had made mistakes. But now, in this fragile moment of rebuilding, They were learning what it meant to meet each other halfway. One afternoon, Julian and Isabella sat together in the living room, a rare quiet moment in the house. Liam was upstairs, finishing his homework. The house was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The tension between Julian and Isabella had been softened, but the weight of their years apart still lingered in the corners of their conversations. "Isabella," Julian began, breaking the silence between them. His voice was steady, but held an undercurrent of something deeper, something uncertain. "I know we're not where we want to be yet, but I just want you to know that I'm committed to this. I'm committed to us." Isabella looked at him, her gaze softening as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. For so long, she had built up walls around herself, convinced that no one could truly understand the hurt she had been carrying. But Julian was trying. He was finally trying to meet her where she needed him to be. "I know," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm trying too, but it's not going to be easy, Julian. I don't expect things to just go back to the way they were. I can't just erase everything that's happened." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with understanding. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to. I want to be a better man for you, for Liam. I want to show you that I'm not just the man who's been neglecting you for years. I want to be the man you need me to be." Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this time, things would be different. But that love she once had for him, the one that made her feel safe and cherished, had been buried under years of disappointment and emotional neglect. Trust didn't come easily after all that had happened. "I know you do," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "But trust takes time, and I can't promise that it's going to happen quickly. I'm not ready to give you everything, Julian. Not yet. I need to see that you're going to show up every day, not just for a week or a month, but for the long haul. That's what I need to believe." Julian nodded again, his eyes soft with sincerity. "I understand," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "And I'm willing to wait. I'll show you. Every day." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Julian's vulnerability, though long overdue, was something Isabella wasn't used to. It was the first real glimpse of the man she had once known. She could feel the sincerity in his words, but still, a part of her resisted. How could she truly believe in him again, when the scars of their past were so fresh? Was she ready to trust him again? Could she risk her heart when it had been so thoroughly broken? And yet, as she sat there with him, the flicker of hope that had been buried for so long started to rise, if only for a brief moment. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild this. But only time would tell if they had the strength to face what was ahead. As the days passed, the fragile understanding between Julian and Isabella continued to grow, albeit slowly. The conversations they shared were often uncomfortable, laced with old wounds and unspoken fears. But they were talking, something they hadn't done in years. Julian was still trying, showing up for Liam and for Isabella in ways he had never done before. He was no longer just a man buried in his work. He was present, attempting to repair the connections he had neglected. For Isabella, it was a strange feeling, like rediscovering a part of herself she had forgotten. She hadn't realized just how much she had withdrawn, emotionally and mentally, from Julian over the years. It had been a survival mechanism, a way of protecting herself from more hurt. She had convinced herself that she could live without him, without his affection, without his presence. But now, seeing him trying to change, trying to reconnect, something inside her began to shift. Slowly, tentatively, she was allowing herself to believe that this could be the beginning of something new. Yet, despite Julian's efforts, Isabella still felt the strain of their past. Every time they were alone, her mind couldn't help but wander to the years of emotional neglect, the lonely nights when she waited for him to come home, only to be met with silence. It was difficult to forget the years she had spent alone in their marriage, waiting for him to return to her, both physically and emotionally. Could she really forgive him for all of that? Could she trust him again? These questions lingered in her mind, and the answers weren't easy to find. The next few weeks passed in a strange, delicate balance of effort and hesitation. Julian continued to be present, attending therapy sessions for Liam and showing up for their family in a way that felt foreign yet right. But Isabella still held back. She couldn't allow herself to forget the hurt, the feeling of being invisible in her own marriage. She wanted to believe in Julian's efforts, but she also needed to see that he was truly committed to changing, not just for Liam, but for her. One afternoon, as Isabella sat on the porch, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was the kind of peace she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed to match the rhythm of her thoughts. She had spent so long running on autopilot, focused solely on taking care of everyone around her, that she had forgotten what it felt like to slow down and breathe. As she sat there, lost in her own thoughts, Julian walked out onto the porch and joined her. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside her, his presence quiet but reassuring. Isabella glanced at him, seeing the familiar lines of worry etched into his face, but also something new, something softer. It wasn't the same man who had once been consumed by his work, who had put business before family. This was a man who seemed genuinely interested in making things right, even if it wasn't always easy for him to express it. After a few moments of silence, Julian spoke, his voice hesitant, unsure. "Isabella, I know this isn't going to be easy. I know that I've hurt you, and I can't take back the things I've done. But I want to show you that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. I want to be part of this family, part of your life again." Isabella looked at him, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had always known that he loved her. That hadn't changed. But love alone wasn't enough. She needed more than just words. She needed to see actions. She needed to know that he was willing to fight for this, for them. "I know you're trying," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's going to take time. It's going to take more than just promises. You've been absent for so long, Julian. I've been doing this alone for years. I can't just pretend that everything is fine, that everything is the way it was." Julian's face fell, his shoulders slumping slightly. He had expected her to say something like that. He had expected the resistance, the hesitation. He couldn't blame her. He had spent so long neglecting her, neglecting them. He had thought that wealth and success would be enough to make everything work, but he had been wrong. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I don't expect everything to be fixed just because I'm showing up now. But I'm here. I'm here for you, for Liam, for us. I'm willing to fight for this. And I will, every single day." Isabella studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. He wasn't just saying the words, he was showing up, not just for their son, but for her too. It was small, these little moments of change, but they were real. "I can't promise you that I'll be able to forgive you immediately," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can try. I'm willing to try. Not just for Liam, but for us. I need to see that you're willing to put in the work. Not just now, but for the long haul." Julian nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'm not going anywhere." Isabella's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but she knew that this was a journey they both had to take together. There would be more conversations like this, more hard moments when they would have to confront the past. But she also knew that for the first time in years, they were both willing to face it, not just for their son, but for each other. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their past still hanging between them. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time, there was hope. And that was enough for now. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone you care about began to show up for you after years of emotional distance? What did it take for you to trust them again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let's talk about the importance of rebuilding trust and commitment in relationships. The weeks following their quiet conversation on the porch had brought a semblance of peace to their home, but it wasn't without its struggles. While Julian and Isabella worked to rebuild their relationship, new obstacles began to arise, testing their resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. Despite their attempts to reconnect, The emotional toll of their past decisions lingered. Trust had been shattered, and even though they were both trying, the scars from their years of emotional distance could not be erased overnight. For Julian, the challenge wasn't just about proving himself to Isabella, it was about facing the consequences of his ambition. He had spent so many years chasing success that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Now that he was finally making time for his family, he was starting to feel the weight of the choices he had made. The guilt of neglecting Isabella and Liam was overwhelming, and he knew he couldn't undo the damage. But he was committed to doing the work. He had to be. Isabella, too, was facing her own set of challenges. She had spent years building a life without Julian, a life where she had learned to stand on her own. She had grown emotionally independent, learned to carry the weight of everything on her own shoulders. And now, as Julian showed up more consistently, it was hard for her to let go of the walls she had carefully built. She didn't know if she was ready to lean on him again, to allow him back into her life completely. One evening, after dinner, the tension in the house seemed to shift. Liam, who had been showing progress at school, was acting out again. His behavior was becoming more erratic, and Isabella could sense that something was troubling him. She didn't know what was happening in his mind, but she could see the storm brewing inside him. And when she received a call from the school the next day, she knew things were taking a turn for the worse. "Liam's been skipping classes," the school counselor told her over the phone, her voice laced with concern. "He's not turning in his assignments and he seems withdrawn. We're worried he might be getting into trouble again." Isabella's heart sank as she listened to the counselor's words. She had hoped that the therapy sessions and the increased attention from both her and Julian would help him. But the truth was, Liam had been struggling for a long time, and no matter how hard they tried to reach him, he remained distant. The phone call felt like a punch to the gut. She had worked so hard to keep things together, to make sure Liam had a stable environment, and now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. Julian, who had been sitting in the living room when Isabella hung up the phone, immediately sensed something was wrong. He saw the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed as she turned away from the call. "Isabella?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "What's going on?" She didn't immediately answer, her mind racing. She had been trying to keep the peace, trying to balance everything, but the weight of Liam's struggles was beginning to break her. She couldn't fix this alone. She couldn't fix everything. "Liam's not doing well," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "He's falling behind at school again. I don't know what's happening with him, but he's pulling away, and I don't know how to help him." Julian stood up and walked toward her, his expression softening with concern. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "We can't fix everything at once, but we'll do it together. We'll get him the help he needs." Isabella looked at him, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that things could get better, but part of her was still afraid of the disappointment, afraid of failing Liam again. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster, and she couldn't help but feel that things were starting to unravel again. "I don't know if we can," she whispered, the doubt in her voice unmistakable. "I don't know if I can handle this again." Julian reached out and gently touched her arm, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You don't have to handle it alone, Isabella. We're in this together. I'll be there for you." For Liam, but Isabella wasn't sure if that was enough. She wasn't sure if his words, his promises, would be enough to undo the years of distance and neglect. The walls between them were still there, still lingering, no matter how much they tried to bridge the gap. That night, as they lay in bed, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't the comfortable silence that had once marked their easy connection. It was filled with doubt, with uncertainty. Julian had been making efforts, yes, but Isabella could still feel the weight of their past hanging over them. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again, not fully, and she wasn't sure if she could lean on him the way she once had. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast, Julian offered to go with Isabella to the school. He wanted to take an active role in helping Liam, to show him that they were both invested in his future. Isabella didn't refuse, but she still felt the weight of hesitation in her chest. She wasn't sure if Julian truly understood the depth of the problem. or if he was just trying to fix things in his usual way, throwing money or effort at it without really seeing the emotional side. They arrived at the school together, the quiet tension between them only growing. As they sat in the counselor's office, listening to the latest report on Liam's behavior, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that things were out of their control. Liam wasn't just acting out because of a bad day at school. There was something deeper, something she hadn't yet been able to reach. And as the counselor spoke, she felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "He's struggling with something," the counselor said, her voice compassionate but firm. "And it's going to take more than just discipline or rewards to fix it. He's emotionally withdrawn, he's shutting people out, and it's likely affecting his performance." Isabella turned to Julian, her eyes filled with concern. He didn't speak at first, but the look on his face showed that he understood. They both knew that this was not just about schoolwork, it was about something deeper, something they couldn't just solve with therapy or interventions. It was about trust, about family, about emotional security, and they both knew it wasn't going to be easy to fix. The days following their meeting at the school were heavy, filled with uncertainty. Julian and Isabella had agreed to take action, but there was a growing tension in the house that neither of them could ignore. Despite their best efforts, Liam continued to shut them out, retreating further into himself. It was as if the more they tried to connect, the more he pushed them away. Isabella found herself in an exhausting cycle, trying to be there for Liam while also grappling with her own doubts about Julian's commitment. Julian had been trying, yes, but his attempts to connect with Liam seemed to fall flat. The emotional barriers between father and son were vast, and the guilt Julian felt seemed to only add to the tension. He was more present than he had been in years, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Every evening, after Liam had gone to bed, Julian and Isabella found themselves in the quiet of the living room, the silence between them thick with the weight of unspoken words. They talked in fragments, small attempts at conversation that always seemed to veer back into the same territory. The challenges with Liam, their fractured relationship, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. One evening, after dinner, Julian set down his glass of water and looked at Isabella with quiet resolve. "I don't know what to do, Isabella," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "I'm trying. I'm here. I'm doing everything I can for Liam, but it's not working. And I'm scared." Isabella sat across from him, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She could see the frustration in his eyes, the helplessness that mirrored her own. She had been feeling the same way, helpless, unsure of what to do next. They had tried so hard, but nothing seemed to be getting through to Liam. "We can't fix everything overnight, Julian," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We're both trying, but it's going to take time. Liam doesn't trust us yet, not completely. And that's not something we can change in a few weeks." Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But I can't help but feel like I'm failing him. I've been so focused on my work, on everything else, and now I can't fix what I've neglected. I don't know how to make it right." Isabella looked at him, her heart aching for the man sitting before her. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the pain that came from knowing he had let so many things slip through his fingers. But she also knew that this was a process they would have to face together, slowly, over time. They couldn't rush it. They couldn't undo the years of mistakes in one go. "You're not failing him, Julian," she said gently, her voice full of compassion. "You're here now. You're showing up for him. And that's what matters. He needs you to be consistent, to keep showing up. He needs to see that you're not going anywhere." Julian nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He was still unsure of what the future held for their family, but he could feel a shift happening inside him. He was committed. Committed to being a better father, a better partner, a better man. And though it wasn't going to be easy, it was the only thing he could do. Isabella placed her hand on his, a small but meaningful gesture. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Enough to let him know that she was with him, that she believed in the possibility of change, even if it was hard to see it clearly right now. "I'm here too," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're in this together. For Liam, for us." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their past still lingering in the air. but the small shift in their connection felt like a step forward. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot. But they were trying. They were both trying, and that was enough, for now. As the days passed, Julian's efforts became more consistent. He attended therapy sessions with Liam, took him out for walks in the park, and made small gestures to show that he was present. But Isabella noticed the struggle in him. He wasn't just trying to connect with Liam, he was trying to redeem himself, to make up for the years he had missed. It was an impossible task, but he was committed to it. Isabella, too, was putting in the effort. She had always been the emotional anchor in their family, the one who kept things together. But now, she was learning to let Julian take some of the burden. She was allowing herself to lean on him, trusting him in ways she hadn't been able to for so long. But even as she did so, doubts crept in. Could she really trust him again? Could she forgive him for all the missed moments, the years of emotional neglect? The journey was long, and the path ahead was uncertain. But every small step, every small moment of vulnerability between them, was a sign that they were moving in the right direction. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. Despite the progress Julian and Isabella had made, the road ahead was still filled with obstacles. The changes they were trying to make, both in their relationship and as a family, weren't without setbacks. Liam's struggles continued to cast a long shadow over their attempts at rebuilding, and the emotional toll of their past mistakes still weighed heavily on them. The good moments were always followed by difficult ones. Julian had been spending more time with Liam, showing up in ways he hadn't before, but their relationship remained strained. Liam's walls were still up, and no matter how hard Julian tried, it seemed impossible to break through. Every step forward felt like it was met with 2 steps back. And while Julian worked hard to remain patient, Isabella could see the frustration building inside him. He wasn't used to feeling so powerless, so unsure of how to fix things. Isabella, too, was feeling the strain. While she had been more open to Julian's efforts, the scars of their past were still fresh. She found herself caught between wanting to trust him again and feeling like she was setting herself up for disappointment. She couldn't ignore the years of hurt, the years of emotional neglect. And even though Julian was trying, it felt like it would take more than a few weeks of consistent effort to rebuild what had been broken. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session with Liam, Julian and Isabella sat in their living room, both of them exhausted and mentally drained. The weight of their struggles seemed to have grown heavier, and the air between them felt thick with the tension of unspoken fears. Liam had become more withdrawn in the past week. His progress seemed to be stalling, and Isabella could see the same signs of frustration that had marked the earlier days. She wasn't sure how to reach him anymore, and Julian seemed at a loss too. The pressure to fix things was mounting, and neither of them knew how to ease the burden they felt. "I don't know what else to do," Julian said quietly, his voice full of frustration. "I've been trying everything, but it's not working. It's like nothing is getting through to him." Isabella sat next to him, her eyes tired but compassionate. She understood his frustration. She felt it too. It was hard to keep showing up, to keep pushing forward, when it seemed like they were making so little progress. Liam's behavior was unpredictable. One day he would make a breakthrough, and the next he would shut them out completely. It was exhausting for both of them. "I know," Isabella said softly, her voice steady. "But we can't fix this overnight. We've spent years building walls between us, and it's going to take time to tear them down. We can't expect everything to change all at once." Julian ran a hand through his hair, his eyes distant. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I keep telling myself it's for him, that it's for Liam, but it feels like it's never enough. I feel like I'm failing him, failing you." Isabella looked at him, her heart aching at the raw emotion in his voice. She could see the weight of guilt in his eyes, the self-blame that had been a constant companion since he had realized how much he had neglected their family. It was something he had never fully understood before, how much his absence had hurt them. But now, as he sat beside her, she could see that he was finally beginning to understand the depth of the damage. "You're not failing him, Julian," she said quietly. "We're both doing everything we can, but we can't do it alone." It's going to take time for Liam to trust us again. It's going to take time for us to trust each other again, and that's okay. We can't rush this process. We have to be patient." Julian nodded, his gaze softening slightly as he absorbed her words. "I don't want to give up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to fail you again. I want to be the man you need me to be. The father Liam needs me to be." Isabella felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had heard him say similar things before, but this time it felt different. There was a sincerity in his voice, a willingness to fight for their family that hadn't been there before. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but maybe, just maybe, they could do this. Together. "We're in this together," Isabella said firmly, her voice full of resolve. "We have to keep showing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels like we're getting nowhere. We're going to keep fighting for Liam. For us." Julian looked at her, his expression softening with the quiet understanding between them. They had both been through so much hurt, so many mistakes, but they were both here, trying to rebuild something that was broken. And as long as they kept showing up for each other, maybe, just maybe, they could make it through the storm. That night, after Liam had gone to bed, Julian and Isabella sat together on the couch, the weight of their conversation still hanging in the air. But there was something different in the way they sat together, something unspoken yet understood. They were facing the challenges ahead, but they weren't facing them alone. "I'm scared," Julian admitted, his voice soft but full of vulnerability. "I'm scared that I'll mess this up again, that I'll fail you, that I'll fail Liam." Isabella reached over and placed her hand on his, her touch gentle but firm. "We're both scared, we're both afraid of failing. But the important thing is that we're trying, and we're here for each other. We can't fix everything at once, but we're making progress. And that's what matters." Julian looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He wasn't carrying the weight of his mistakes by himself. Isabella was with him every step of the way, and that meant more to him than he could put into words. "I'll keep trying," he said quietly, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll keep showing up. For you. For Liam. For us." Isabella smiled faintly, the small gesture a sign of hope that they could get through this. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and hard work. But they were both willing to fight for the family they had once been, for the family they could still be. The following weeks felt like both a burden and a breakthrough. Julian and Isabella had made it through the hardest parts of the last few months, the difficult conversations, the unspoken frustrations, the raw admissions of guilt. But there was still so much left to do, and the emotional toll was becoming harder to bear. Julian and Isabella had shown up for each other, but they were starting to realize that rebuilding their family wasn't just about healing the rifts between them. It was about facing the underlying issues that had caused them in the first place. Liam's behavior continued to be erratic. Some days he would show progress, attending therapy sessions with a slightly more open attitude, engaging in conversations with his parents about his feelings. Other days, he would retreat further into himself, shutting them out and retreating into his bedroom or his headphones. He was angry, more angry than any child should be. And although Isabella and Julian both felt like they were doing everything they could, nothing seemed to fully reach him. The emotional walls he had built around himself were towering, and no matter how much they tried to climb over them, they kept running into resistance. But something had changed. Julian had finally realized that this was no longer just about fixing Liam. It wasn't just about getting him to behave or get good grades. It was about healing the underlying emotional scars that had been left by years of emotional neglect, by the absence of his father, by the disconnection between his parents. Julian couldn't fix everything in a few months. He couldn't erase the damage he had caused with a few well-meaning gestures. But he could be present, and he could give Liam the emotional space he needed to start healing, even if it meant taking small steps forward every day. One afternoon, after yet another challenging conversation with Liam, Julian and Isabella found themselves sitting in the living room, the weight of the day heavy on their shoulders. They hadn't made much progress with Liam, but they hadn't given up either. There was something about this fight that felt different, Something about the way they were working together, not just as parents but as partners, gave them both a small sense of hope. "I don't know what else to do," Julian said quietly, his voice filled with frustration. "I've tried everything. I've been here. I've been present. But he still won't open up. He still won't trust me. And I don't know how to make him trust me." Isabella looked at him, her expression soft but filled with understanding. "Julian, this isn't just about you. This is about him. He's not ready yet. It's going to take time. We can't rush him. We can't force him to heal before he's ready." Julian exhaled, rubbing his hands across his face. "I know, but I feel like I'm failing him." "I'm failing both of you." "You're not failing us," Isabella replied, her voice steady but warm. "You're here, you're trying, and that's all we can do right now. We've been through a lot, but we're here now, and we have to trust that even if it takes time, things will get better." She reached over and gently placed her hand on his, her touch reassuring. The simple act of physical contact, of connection, felt like a lifeline in the midst of the emotional uncertainty they were both facing. Julian squeezed her hand gently, the gesture a silent acknowledgement of the emotional weight they were both carrying. "I'm so scared, Isabella," Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared that I'm not doing enough, that I'm failing him, that I'm failing you." Isabella's heart ached at his words. She could feel the depth of his regret, the weight of the guilt that he had been carrying for so long. But she knew that this wasn't about perfection. This wasn't about doing everything right. This was about showing up. For Liam, for each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "You're not failing us, Julian," she said softly. "You're here. That's all that matters. You're here. And we're doing this together. We don't have all the answers, but we're making progress, and that's enough for now." The room fell silent as they sat together, their hands still intertwined. They weren't where they wanted to be yet, far from it, but they were on the right path. They had started rebuilding the foundation of their family, brick by brick, moment by moment. As the evening wore on, the tension between them seemed to ease. They were still navigating the challenges of raising a son who was struggling emotionally, and they were still learning how to reconnect with each other after so many years of emotional distance. But in that moment, with their hands linked together, there was a quiet understanding between them, a mutual recognition that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey, a journey they would face together. It had been several months since the turning point in their relationship. Julian and Isabella had come a long way since the fragile moments of vulnerability they had shared in the living room that night. The wounds of the past hadn't healed completely, but they were learning how to move forward, together, one day at a time. Julian's commitment to his family, especially to Liam, had never wavered. His presence was no longer just about making amends, it was about being there, truly being there, for them both. Isabella had watched him change in ways that felt almost too subtle to describe, but they were real. He was showing up every day, and that, for now, was enough. He was still Julian, still the man who had once been consumed by ambition, but he was also someone new, someone who had learned the hard way what it meant to be a father, a husband, and a partner. For Isabella, the road had been just as difficult. She had spent years building walls around herself, afraid to let anyone in. She had to learn to trust again, to allow Julian to be a part of their family without the shadow of the past hanging over her. It wasn't easy, and it still wasn't perfect, but she had started to believe that they could rebuild. Not just their relationship, but their family, and that belief had begun to carry her forward. As the weeks passed, the emotional distance between them continued to shrink. Julian's relationship with Liam had slowly improved, though there were still moments of frustration. Liam was still trying to find his way, still navigating the emotional turmoil that had built up over the years. But there were glimpses of progress, small victories that gave them hope. Liam was starting to open up, to trust them again, even if it was just a little at a time. One evening, after dinner, Julian and Isabella sat together on the porch, the night air cool and crisp. They had both been working late that day, and the house had been full of noise, Liam's music blasting from upstairs, the sound of dishes being washed. But now, in the quiet of the evening, There was a stillness between them that felt right. They sat side by side, not speaking at first, just listening to the sounds of the neighborhood and the distant hum of traffic. "I've been thinking about something," Julian said after a long pause, his voice quiet but steady. Isabella turned her head slightly to look at him, a soft smile on her face. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about our future," he said, his tone thoughtful, almost uncertain. "Not just our family, but everything. I want to build a future with you. Not just for Liam, but for us, for me and you. We've both been through so much, and I know we're not where we want to be yet, but I think we're getting there. I think we can get there." Isabella felt her heart swell at his words. She had known deep down that this was where they were headed, that this was what he wanted too. But hearing him say it, hearing him acknowledge the future they could build together, brought a new sense of clarity. She had spent so long doubting their chances of reconciliation, so long living with the fear that it was too late. But now, as she sat beside him, watching the soft glow of the streetlights filter through the trees, she realized that it wasn't too late. They had both grown. They had both changed. And together, they had the chance to build something new. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want a future with you. I know we've both made mistakes, but I think we can make it work. We can't go back to what we were, but we can build something new. A future where we're not just trying to fix everything, but where we're growing together." Julian looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I don't want to go back. I want to move forward, together. We've got a lot to figure out, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this for the long haul. For you. For Liam." Isabella reached out, her hand resting on his, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but in this moment, with Julian beside her, she felt like they had a chance. Not just to rebuild their relationship, but to rebuild their family. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more struggles ahead, but they were in this together. That was what mattered most. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said, her voice full of quiet determination. "We'll keep showing up for each other every day, and we'll build this future, slowly but surely, together." Julian squeezed her hand gently, a small but meaningful gesture of solidarity. The promise of a new beginning, one that wasn't about erasing the past but learning from it, filled the space between them. Isabella looked at him, her heart full of a quiet hope that had once felt impossible. She wasn't sure when exactly the shift had happened, when they had moved from the edge of despair to the possibility of something new. But in this moment, surrounded by the quiet of the night, she knew they had made it. They had come through the hardest part. They had come through the darkness, and now they were beginning to build something that had the potential to last. In the weeks following their quiet conversation on the porch, Julian and Isabella began to settle into a new rhythm. Their life together was still a work in progress, but there was an undeniable shift. The emotional distance that had once consumed them seemed less suffocating, though it was still there, quietly lurking in the corners. But now, there was a new energy between them, a shared determination to build a family, not just out of duty or habit, but out of love and mutual respect. Liam, too, was beginning to show signs of progress. His anger still simmered under the surface, and he continued to wrestle with his own emotional struggles, but he was starting to let down his guard, ever so slightly. He would occasionally speak to Julian in ways that felt like a breakthrough, a moment of trust that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time, Julian could see the possibility of a real father-son connection starting to form. One evening, after dinner, Julian and Isabella sat together in the living room, watching as Liam fiddled with his phone, lost in his world. There was a sense of quiet peace in the room that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a loud or chaotic peace. It was a subtle, soft kind of peace. A peace that came from knowing they had fought for this family, knowing they had worked to get here, even though the path had been long and difficult. "Do you think we're getting through to him?" Julian asked, breaking the silence between them. He had been watching Liam, his eyes full of concern, but also hope. "I know it's slow, but I think he's starting to trust me." Isabella watched her son, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had always known that Liam was a smart, capable young man, but his anger and hurt had built a wall around him that was difficult to break down. She had spent years protecting him, shielding him from the emotional wreckage of their broken relationship. Now, she was seeing small cracks in that wall, and though it was painful to watch, it was also a sign of progress. "I think he is," Isabella said softly. "He's letting you in more than he used to. It's not easy for him, Julian. He's been hurt too, but you're doing the right things. You're here for him. You're showing him that you're not going anywhere." Julian nodded, his eyes never leaving Liam's form. "I just want him to know that I'm here. For him, for us. I don't want him to ever feel like I'm abandoning him again." Isabella placed her hand on his, a quiet gesture that held more meaning than words could convey. "He'll get there. He's not ready to fully trust us yet, but he's trying. And that's what matters." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they both watched Liam, the weight of their words hanging between them. It was still a delicate balance, Liam's progress, their evolving relationship, but there was a sense of calm that had begun to settle in the house. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its setbacks, but they were getting through it, together. As the evening went on, Isabella stood up to clear the dinner plates, and Julian followed her into the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, there was no tension, no avoidance. They moved together in a shared, comfortable space, their connection deepening not through grand gestures, but through the quiet acts of love they were slowly rebuilding. "Isabella," Julian said, his voice thoughtful as he helped her rinse the dishes. "I've been thinking about what you said, about rebuilding, and I want you to know that I'm not just trying to rebuild my relationship with Liam. I'm trying to rebuild mine with you, too." Isabella paused, her hands frozen in the water. She looked up at him, her heart fluttering at the sincerity in his eyes. They hadn't talked much about their relationship lately, about the emotional distance that still lingered between them. But this moment, in the quiet of their kitchen, felt like a turning point. She had spent so long guarding her heart, so long afraid of being hurt again, that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. "I want that too, Julian," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "I know it's not going to be easy, and I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to try, for us, for Liam." Julian smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that held the weight of everything they had gone through to get to this point. "We'll take it one step at a time, no rushing, just one day at a time." Isabella nodded, her heart swelling with the hope that had been buried deep inside her for so long. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like they were on the same page. They were both committed to rebuilding, not just their family, but their love. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. And that, she realized, was enough for now. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet and they prepared to go to bed, Isabella stood by the window, looking out at the stars. Julian had already gone upstairs, but she lingered for a moment longer, lost in her thoughts. There had been so much hurt, so much pain between them, and yet here they were, still standing, still trying. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to dream of a future where their family was whole again, where trust had been rebuilt, and where love wasn't just a memory, but something they could hold on to. It wasn't perfect, but maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Julian, Isabella, and Liam. Rebuilding a relationship, especially after years of emotional distance, is never easy. But through trust, vulnerability, and small, consistent efforts, it's possible to move forward, together. So, let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you needed to rebuild trust after a difficult period in your life or relationship? How did you navigate that journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your experience with us. Remember, love and connection take time, and sometimes the smallest steps forward lead to the biggest changes. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartfelt emotional journeys, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Stay tuned for more, and as always, thank you for being a part of our community.